Well, everyone, I am so pleased to have you all here in person and hello at home to introduce Kathleen Alonso, who will be talking about tracking aviation's trailblazers by the waterways today. Now, Kathy is a historian and researcher who has been researching the history of airmail for 20 years. She has a master's degree from the University of Nebraska Omaha, and she is also, on the weekend when she has time, a docent at the Evanston History Center and Charles Dawes House. Now, that's how I met Kathy, and she told me a little bit about this ongoing project and showed me another iteration of this talk that she was giving for another organization. And I was struck by how many surprising connections there were between air and water in this instance. And I knew immediately she would be a perfect fit for our third Friday lecture. So very happy. I hope you all welcome Kathy along with me at home and in person.
Thank you. Hello, as Madeline said, my name is Kathy Alonso, and about 20 years ago, I started digging up information on the airmail service. And like Madeline said, when I spoke last year in Evanston for the 100th anniversary of night airmail, she thought that there were some connections worth exploring. I actually found more than I expected to, and I'm really glad I kind of looked at that side of this topic. So on May 18th, 1918, the post office began regularly flying the mail from New York to Washington, D.C. A relatively inexperienced pilot who just happened to be engaged to the daughter of the Interstate Commerce Commissioner followed the wrong set of railroad tracks out of Washington, D.C. and crash landed south of town. The following day, he attempted the feat again, and he was actually flying to Philadelphia, where the intermediary stop was. And a pilot got him going in the right direction and advised him to keep the water on his right, which he did. The water in this case being the Chesapeake Bay. So he took the grand tour of the Chesapeake Bay. When he could no longer go north, he turned south, and once again, crash landed south of DC, thus ending his airmail career no matter who he was engaged to. Future pilots did make better use of the water below them. Now, in order for airmail to have any chance of becoming practical, it had to be able to compete with trains. The distance between Washington, D.C. and New York was not long enough to seriously affect the time it took for a letter to get delivered. So the post office almost immediately began pushing west towards Cleveland and Chicago. The planes did not have the fuel capacity to not fly nonstop. So there were a lot of intermediary fields between New York and Cleveland. People stopped in Bellefonte, Pennsylvania. They stopped in Bryan, Ohio, between Cleveland and Chicago. And because of the Allegheny Mountains, which were also known as Hell's Stretch, the pilots flew reliably from Chicago to Cleveland before they were flying from Cleveland to New York. The post office was continually working to address these issues, but they still continued to push west. In September of 1920, the post office marked an incredible milestone when the first transcontinental airmail route was completed. This was the equivalent of the Lincoln Highway, of the Oregon Trail. Also in terms of maritime terms, it was the equivalent of like the Mississippi River or the Great Lakes or the Hudson River, just being able to get people across the country. It also, there we go. The success of the newest form of transportation added to, and in many ways became intertwined with the country's waterways. Whether using rivers for navigational purposes or relying on technology that was initially designed for ships, the pilots of the airmail service owed much to the rivers, lakes, and bays which passed below them. So much so that once the post office turned the flying business over to private companies in 1927, the infrastructure they created fell to the Bureau of Lighthouses, the predecessor of the Coast Guard. The link between air and water actually began long before motorized flight even escaped the realm of science fiction. Prior to the railroad, these rivers and lakes are what drove the development of the country, and therefore it's where the major cities were created. Aviation generally did not create cities. What it did was it connected cities that were already large and growing and had been built decades before. The first half of the transcontinental route, for example, connected New York to Cleveland to Chicago to Omaha, Nebraska, all towns with very rich, very deep river-related histories. Further west in the desert climate of Cheyenne, Salt Lake City, and Reno, the water sources were just significant because they were there. And when they started branching off of the main line, for example, flying from Chicago to Salt Lake City or Chicago to Minneapolis, again, they're flying to cities with stories around the water. Now, it is worth mentioning that in 1920, things looked pretty rudimentary. For example, this is the main hangar at the Omaha airport, which includes a de Havilland IV plane. The history of planes in the airmail service is its own topic, but the de Havilland IV became the main workhorse of the post office. They got a good deal on the planes and a lot of spare parts after World War I. During the war, this had been kind of the first cargo plane as opposed to the smaller fighter jets. And the post office was continually making improvements, improving the landing gear to improve safety and reliability. Or here is a mail plane, the picture we saw before, flying over the countryside in the early 1920s. Another thing that was rudimentary in the 1920s was navigation. Aerial maps did not exist. Pilots would sometimes utilize road maps, but they had their own set of challenges. For one thing, they didn't usually mark elevation, which is kind of important. And the towns below them weren't necessarily marked. This was before you had the town name painted on the water tower or the train depot. So if a pilot wasn't familiar with an area, they may not even know what town they were flying over. So the most reliable way to travel was to either follow a river or the railroad tracks. And in some ways, rivers were more reliable because several railroad tracks could converge on one town. That being said, as pilots were flying these routes daily over and over, they did become very familiar with the routes and what was going on below them. When the transcontinental route opened, the post office created a set of written instructions to guide the pilots. These instructions in and of themselves indicate the importance of rivers because they are mentioned frequently either as landmarks, this is where you should be crossing the Mississippi River, or in cases where you could be following a river for a considerable distance. And as the airmail route developed, pilots tended to follow the rivers more closely even than the official instructions indicated. One major example of this, is the section of the route between Omaha and North Platte, Nebraska. These two cities are at roughly the same longitude, and if you skip all the details, the pilot instructions basically say fly from Omaha to North Platte. Go west until you get to North Platte. Pilots never really did this. What I have marked in blue is the Platte River, and they would go pretty much due west out of Omaha, and then they would pick up the Platte River and follow it into North Platte. There are several reasons why pilots would do this. First of all, anybody who tells you that Nebraska is flat has never left I-80. I-80 is the Platte River Valley, and I will grant you it is flat. However, this northern section north of the river is quite hilly country, so there were fewer landing fields. And in the 1920s, forced landings were a matter of when, not if. Um, the pilots, they had a wide variety of adventures. The northern route was also more sparsely populated than the Platte River Valley, which meant that it was farther to find help in case of an emergency. For example, when you're following the Platte River, there was a town of some size every 5 to 10 miles, either a railroad water stop or a farming community. For example, one of my favorite stories is when Ernest Arbuckle, who was a farmer near Gibbon, Nebraska, looked up and found pilot Clarence Lang landing in his field. The two men did what most men would do in that situation, which is grab a couple of wrenches, proverbially pop the hood of the airplane, and try and fix the problem. When that didn't work, Arbuckle was able to get Lang and the mail to North Platte, where it could be put on a train and carried on. And the other thing along this route, as you can see, I've marked Grand Island. Grand Island had an airfield that was used for local pilots, and this became a pretty important intermediary stop. So pilots that just needed to wait out the weather could land in Grand Island. My personal favorite isn't necessarily an airmail story, but one of the famous airmail pilots was Jack Knight. He took some time off of work and told his friends that he was going fishing. What he actually did was fly to New York, jump in a plane with another pilot, and attempt to fly nonstop across the country. They had bearing issues over Kansas, and it was like, we're not going to make it. So what did Knight do? He turned north and landed in Grand Island, which was his familiar territory. Other times, pilots landed on farmland, golf courses, and occasionally the river itself. Here's a park that one pilot landed at when he was out of gas. And when pilots, in this case, the field was in Omaha, so getting it to the airport wasn't hard. When this happened in other communities, usually what you would do is put it on the train. Otherwise, a pilot would fly in and pick it up. And further west, things were a little bit more difficult. For example, Henry Boonstra crashed on Porcupine Ridge, which is in the general vicinity of Colville, Utah, in 1922. He spent a day and a half wading through waist-deep snow before finding a ranch house. His pilot's coat kept him from freezing to death, but it was definitely a completely different situation. And the Platte River was not the only road that pilots followed. In Pennsylvania, the Susquehanna was very common landmark. And again, the pilot directions from 1920 frequently are mentioning to pilots where they should be in relationship to the Susquehanna. But especially when there was a fog or there were issues with visibility, the pilots might just fly right on top of it to get to where they were going. Pilots would obviously fly south of Lake Erie across Ohio. Again, another waterway that's pretty hard to miss. Now, the instructions did clearly state to stay about 10 miles south of the lake. There were several reasons for this. For one thing, it was harder to keep track of the horizon, which is fairly important. Also, over the lake, there tended to be more unusual or less predictable air currents, just like there are today. And the achievements of the post office did not come without a cost. Over 24 pilots and mechanics died between 1918 and 1921, which caused Congress and the public to question whether the service was worth the cost. So just a few names I like to mention. Dinty Moore, who crashed in Wyoming. He was following the railroad tracks through inclement weather and crashed into a ridge. John Woodward of Mitchellville, Iowa, has a similar story. James Christensen actually crashed in Cleveland. Cleveland had a fairly small airport at the time, and he wasn't able to locate it on one foggy day. He headed toward the river, but apparently ran out of gas and crashed before getting there. And as time went on, the fatalities and the service continued to improve. And that's the big thing about the airmail service. It wasn't one big thing that happened. It was just these pilots flying day in, day out from point A to point B. But they're still into the 20s, into the 30s. There were still a lot of crashes and there were still things that happened. This is a piece of Frank Yeager's plane. He crashed in 1928 and he survived, but his passenger Samuel Craig did not. Mom and Dad and I found this at the Plainsman Museum in Aurora, Nebraska. That was a fun trip. And one of the reasons that the service continued to improve was instrumentation. In 1920 and before, when pilots got off the ground, it was pretty much visual flying. You saw what you could see, and if you hit a fog, if you hit any sort of weather, you were on your own and you were guessing. Well, in 1912, Elmer Sperry created a company that utilized the gyroscope, and he started improving navigation for ships. Standard compasses lacked reliability due to the metal in the ship, and especially in places like Lake Superior when you're dealing with the iron deposits. Sperry's compass operated using an electrical current that indicated true north rather than magnetic north. And eventually a series of clicks would tell the captain if the ship began drifting off course. There's a Sperry gyro compass that's up at the Soltroy Lighthouse Museum up by Gulliver, Michigan. In the 1920s, Sperry used the gyroscope to tackle the problem of aerial navigation, and his instruments made their way into airplanes throughout the 1920s. They produced an artificial horizon, which helped pilots be able to fly level. Before that, you might say hang a watch in your cockpit and try and use that to figure out if you were flying straight or not. Otherwise, you could definitely come out of a fog bank and land into the ground. He also created a bank and turn indicator, which helped pilots figure out where they were going and allowed them to turn and navigate through the fog. Before that, pilots basically flew by dead reckoning. You would either get above the clouds or fly through the fog and kind of check your watch and say, okay, I've been in the air 2 hours. It's time to land. I hope the field's there. And that's not dissimilar to what ships were doing in the Great Lakes prior to about the 1850s when that navigational system began to take shape. If you couldn't see where you were going, you just had to kind of go straight ahead and hope for the best. When Jimmy Doolittle made his famous blind flight in 1929, where he took off, flew and landed with his cockpit completely covered, a lot of the instruments he was using were first being used during the airmail service. But let me backtrack a little bit and get back to 1920. The post office very quickly decided that, again, if it wanted to compete with trains and possibly even the telegraph, the airmail basically needed to be flown overnight. Before that, the pilots flew until sundown, dropped the mail off, it would be picked up by a train, and if necessary, someone would pick it up again in the morning. The first night flight was a promotional event that took place in February of 1921. The post office, facing the annual budget battle with Congress and some bad publicity due to high-profile crashes, wanted to make a statement. And so they decided, again in February, that they were going to fly both day and night. So they took off and got over the Rockies and the Appalachians during the day. And then the plan was for towns in the Midwest between Cheyenne and Chicago to light bonfires to guide the pilots. They had some problems. Basically, the weather was very bad in the east. One of the eastbound planes crashed, killing the pilot, and the two westbound pilots ended up being stuck in Chicago. They tried to keep going, they just couldn't quite make it. But Jack Knight landed in Omaha, Nebraska, which he thought was where he would stop and turn the plane over to another pilot. However, that pilot was still stuck in Chicago. So Jack Knight studied the map on the wall, got back in the plane, and became an epic national hero with cartoons and with like his image on gum wrappers. It was a very big deal. And he flew overnight and made it to Chicago. A lot has been made of Knight having never flown that route before. And while it's true he had never flown the mail from Omaha to Chicago, I like to mention that he had flown from Chicago to Cleveland. He was also from Buchanan, Michigan, which is by South Bend. So he was not completely unfamiliar with the territory. Now, the post office next trick, because this was very obviously a one-time promotional event, would be to fly the mail regularly overnight. But that included its own set of challenges. For example, something more reliable than bonfires would have to be created to keep pilots on course. If only somebody had considered how we might possibly light the night sky. If only somebody had considered that. Obviously, the post office was not starting from scratch. Instead of building stone lighthouses, they used a metal frame more like the base of a windmill. But at the top, there was a rotating light beacon powered by either gas or electricity. And they did have men hired to replace these and maintain the lights to pilots should they land in the area. And in some more remote locations, there were essentially these lighthouse keepers who spent the winter next to the light, which is not unlike someone on the banks of Lake Michigan hunkering down for the winter. Like lighthouses, there were different illumination strengths. The brightest lights would be at the major airports. Other lights would mark emergency landing fields along the way. This is an example of one of the smaller lights. These could still be seen for 20 to 30 miles on a clear night. There's one night in 1929 where a pilot took Ernie Pyle up to about 10,000 feet, and he could see 6 beacons or 120 miles north and south along the East Coast. Pyle at the time was actually writing an aviation column in Washington, D.C. For a Washington, D.C. newspaper. Of course, he later would become famous for writing about the soldiers during World War II. Now, before they got to this point, the post office did have some baby steps. There was early test flying at North Platte, Nebraska. They chose North Platte for a couple of reasons. First of all, that area is relatively level. You get much west of there and you have to start worry about crashing into the mountains, which they didn't want to do. Also, it has a lower population density, so people were less concerned about planes crashing into buildings. One of several reasons that Chicago's first airport, which was located in Grant Park, was moved to Maywood is because in 1919, a dirigible crashed into the Illinois Savings and Loan Bank and ended up killing 10 people on the ground. So this is a marker at the site of Checkerboard Field, which is now Miller Meadow, where the second airmail field was, and they would later build a third airmail field across the street where there's a hospital today. In North Platte, when they were doing these tests, the staff planted posts along the Platte River, and they would put up lanterns in order to mark the river so that pilots knew where to go. And then they would build 2 big bonfires to guide the incoming pilots. Because of these efforts, North Platte claimed the status of the first lighted airfield in the country. This is actually not dissimilar to what the citizens of Vermilion, Ohio did. Well, they were waiting for the federal government to give them a lighthouse for the harbor. Before the lighthouse was authorized in 1847, they drove posts to the water to hang lanterns between the harbor and the mouth of the river to guide boats to the harbor. In neither case were lanterns seen as a permanent solution, but it does show that you do what you have to do to get things done. So the first scheduled night flights did mark the beginning of a new era. And they started flying, the first night flight was in 1924. In the fall of 1923, they'd had like a 5-day test run. And then they started regularly flying on July 1st, June 1st of 1924. But the post office had yet another goal. Being able to mail a letter in Cheyenne or Omaha in time to reach Chicago the following morning lacked the business clout of being able to mail a letter between Chicago and New York, the 2 largest cities in the country, without wasting a business day. So the theory was you get your letter in the mail by 5 p.m. in New York, it'll be in Chicago at the opening of business. Not only would this compete with trains, it could encourage businesses to eliminate some telegrams. John E. Whitbeck, a former Navy machinist mate and wartime captain in the engineering division of the Army Air Service, found himself in charge of building the next leg of the airway. He had the unenviable task of finding emergency landing fields which required a clear 40 acres in the mountains of Western Pennsylvania. By March of 1925, timber was being removed, ditches were being tilled and graded, and tree stumps were being blasted across the state. This was quite a bit different from the Great Plains, where there were plenty of fields and golf courses, and like Grand Island had the pilot's field or the regular flying field that were available. However, they persevered, and on July 1st, 1925, just 1 year after the first scheduled night flight, the post office began flying overnight between New York and Chicago. Crowds in cities along the route arrived to mark the event. In Chicago, Paul Henderson, the airmail superintendent, gave a speech, as did Madeline and I's favorite Vice President Charles Dawes. Dawes also included a box of flowers for the ailing father of Calvin Coolidge. Although I have to admit, I don't actually believe the newspapers on that one, at least not without providing credit to Dawes' other half, Caro, who, if you know about their relationship, would be the one to send flowers. The new route proved to be a phenomenal success. It carried approximately 30,000 pounds of letters during the first 3 months of operations, and the service only continued to expand. Future routes, such as one from New York to Atlanta, would also be flown overnight. And you can really see with this map, if you look at the modern aviation system and where some of the hubs are in Atlanta, in Salt Lake City, you can really see how things got to where they are. So the next step in aerial navigation would be radio towers. When communities created airports in 1920, there was a radio tower at the airport, and these airports would communicate with each other regarding things like weather and pilot ETAs. There was also a little bit of plane-to-ground experimentation. In December of 1923, Jack Knight conversed with both Omaha and North Platte while flying between the 2 cities. But that was kind of set aside, and radios in the planes would not become widespread until the mid to late 1930s. However, in the late 1920s, radio towers were installed along major routes. They would send out Morse code signals that pilots could pick up to help keep the pilots on course. Coincidentally, this was the same area that radio towers started to be installed at key coastal locations for ships, first at lighthouses along the Atlantic coast and then along the Great Lakes. These worked quite a bit better than a foghorn usually. And again, you would send out a simple Morse code signal unique to the location. So ships looking to either find a particular harbor or avoid a particular area known for its uneven sea terrain would know where to go or to avoid. And these continued transmitting for decades. In the mid-1960s, one captain, Richard Metz, reported using one to get his tugboat on course after electrical issues caused problems with the radar. He was able to pull out the old radio direction finder and get close enough to Passage Island to hear the signal. Now, these radios weren't perfect. Interference or noise like thunderstorms could make them difficult to hear. In December of 1934, pilots Dick Merrill and Bill Frant got a surprise when treetops started hitting the bottom of their plane, which they thought was quite a bit higher than that. They'd actually been blown off course into the mountains in western New York, and they had no fatalities, but they had a crash landing in the mountains with passengers. So again, some interesting stories there. Weather prediction also has its roots in transportation. By 1971, the Army was beginning to try and collect data like wind velocity and barometer readings from various locations and telegraph those to a central point. This philosophy was based on basically the simple principle that weather in the United States travels from west to east. My parents live in Nebraska and were just commenting that the weather we have now, they had yesterday. On November 11th, 1871, many ships across the Great Lakes stayed in port because the Signal Corps in Omaha sent out word of a storm. So ships had between 5 and 20 hours to make decisions and figure out what they were going to do in regards to the weather. The tip likely saved a lot of cargo and several lives. The airmail service was not quite as intricate, but the philosophy was the same. In 1925, it took 2 to 3 hours to fly from one point to another along the airmail route, and it would take about a week to sail from Chicago to Buffalo. So with the airmail service, typically what you did is you would radio a town or two ahead of you and say, what's the weather look like there? And if they were reported major fog, you may wait where you were at for a while. The entire aviation system that we have today traces its roots to the airmail service. The post office ran it until 1927 when the last routes were contracted to private airlines. They actually started contracting out some of the routes, like from Chicago to St. Louis in 1925. But in 1927, the half of the transcontinental leg between Chicago and San Francisco was given to Boeing, and then National Air Transport had Chicago to New York. So this is one of the Boeing planes, obviously, and Robertson aircraft, for which Charles Lindbergh briefly worked, traveled from St. Louis to Chicago. Passenger routes were based around getting a contract for the mail. There's a story with Eddie Rickenbacker and Eastern Airlines where he bid 0 cents to haul the mail because he wanted one particular route. He wanted the rights to the route, and he had to get the mail to do it. Even when the post office was in charge, outside entities were using the post office structure, the airports, the light beacons, the apparatus that they had set up. Here's an example. In 1924, the United States Army became the first entity to fly planes around the world. There were 4 planes total. I think ultimately 2 of them made it through the entire trip. This is them landing at the Fort Crook Airfield in Omaha, Nebraska. Or in 1927, Calvin Coolidge famously spent the summer in the Black Hills of South Dakota. He was able to do this because of the airmail service. The regular airmail would fly the letters from Washington, D.C. to North Platte, Nebraska, and then the Army would fly the mail from North Platte to Rapid City. And he makes it very clear in his parting speech that had it not been for the development of navigation of the air and the use of the airplane to transport mail, it would not have been possible for a president of the United States to spend any such extended length of time away from Washington. And this was by several states, the farthest a president had ever had a summer vacation. So like I keep saying, it is impossible to overstate the role the post office had in modern aviation. The experiment succeeded because of a variety of people. There were congressmen who were busy pushing through funding. There were town leaders who were building airports and gaining support for these. And there were a lot of individual people who were just helping pilots who fell out of the sky. I particularly like this. This is an award that Northwestern Bell gave to telephone operators who acted above and beyond the call of duty. Mabel Height lived in Potter, Nebraska, which is a very small town in the western part of the state. And there was a snowstorm, and the airmail pilot flew overhead, and then she just heard it circling town. So she called the airfield in Sidney, Nebraska, and said, "What do we do?" And he said, "Get some flares and show the pilot where to land." The town people did this, and Allie Allison landed safely. Another indicator of the value of airmail is to look at the places that airmail pilots ended up. This entire group of people and the mechanics and the leaders of the service all use their expertise to continue to help the development of aviation. Dean Smith flew over Antarctica on Admiral Byrd's 1928 trip because Byrd wanted an experienced cross-country flyer. Ernest Allie Allison, along with Steve Kaufman and Henry Smith, took off for China in 1929. China's first airline, the China National Aviation Corporation, or CNAC, was founded and put together by airmail pilots from the United States. Slim Lewis, after running the western portion of the airmail service, became Boeing's chief of B-17 flight production during the war. He tapped Allie Allison, who was temporarily back in the States, and Frank Yeager, among others, to help test fly both the B-17s and the B-29s. James Murray became a vice president at Boeing. Part of the reason pilots could fly these B-17s was because he persuaded the company not to drop the program after the Flying Fortress had some initial testing trouble. Jack Knight, who we discussed before, moved up the ladder with United Airlines, continued flying for them, and then essentially was in their promotional department during World War II. He was giving speeches about the value of civil aviation. He also was helping locate resources for the war. He contracted malaria down in the Amazon while looking for rubber. And then Bill Gifford, who had flown the mail along the East Coast, Actually, Ernie Pyle ran into him again in the Marianas Islands piloting B-29s over Japan. And the list goes on. So many of these pilots who at least crossed paths with the airmail have stories about the things and the value that they served for aviation. By 1925, this B-17 could fly over 35,000 feet at more than 300 miles an hour. It could carry about 8,000 pounds. In 1920, this de Havilland DH-4 flew at just over 120 miles an hour and topped out at around 14,000 feet. And its cargo load was about 1,600 pounds. So that's quite a difference in 25 years. And a major reason we got to one from the other is the airmail service. The post office trained pilots. It provided a mechanism for testing new technology. It created the template for the commercial aviation system that we ultimately utilize today. They gave private companies an opportunity and an incentive to continue developing technology. They gave towns an incentive to improve airports, and it just gave people an opportunity for them to see what planes could do for them in their everyday lives. It brought planes out of this era of kind of barnstorming and independent aviation into something that had practical real world application. And it also gave little boys a vision of taking over the skies when they grew up. Calvin Coolidge's the following summer after he was in Rapid City, he was in Poplar, Wisconsin over the summer. And a young boy named Richard Bong saw the planes flying overhead and decided he wanted to take up flying, and he would become the country's leading ace in World War II. So on that note, I do want to thank Madeline for encouraging me to look at aviation from a maritime standpoint. I have enjoyed the ride. And if you are interested, here is a very short selection of recommended reading. Some of these are easier to come by than others. Do we have any questions? Thank you. Thank you.
So how far could the plane fly back into the
There are a lot of factors to that. Are you flying into the wind? Are you flying with the wind? But generally speaking, like Chicago to Omaha is about 500 miles, and they wanted an intermediary route about halfway between. So there was one in Iowa City. So, generally they had a field every 250 miles. Depending on the weather and, like I said, factors, pilots could fly further. They did have a fuel gauge. Yeah, they didn't have an altimeter. Yeah, well, and even you run into situations where they started to have altimeters in like the early 1920s, but altimeters are related to air pressure, which can be affected by a variety of factors. So sometimes pilots ran into problems because their altimeter said that they were higher than they thought they were because the air pressure had dropped. But yeah, about the 1920s is when you started to see things like altimeters, like the bank and turn indicator, like the artificial horizon, to try and. Yeah, so the 30s would have been when you started having radio communication between planes and the ground. And a lot of that too depended on what airline you were flying with. The major airlines like United, which is spun off of Boeing, was going to have that equipment faster than some of the smaller companies. Yes.
How much does the common airmail stand?
That I don't remember. I should know. But the airmail stamp was more than a regular stamp, although the post office got to a point where they basically, just because they were flying the mail and wanted to promote it, eventually that ended. But yeah, there was a special.
Didn't they have special paper?
Yeah, I think when you were ruling, and some of that was overseas, but they would definitely have had some thinner paper. I don't know that it was all thinner because they also transported things like checks. They transported goods. There was one case where a pilot crashed and apparently there had been diamonds on the plane. In the early days when they were trying to promote the service and it was you were paid per pound. There were some companies that were like mailing bricks to increase their tonnage. So the weight of the paper wasn't a significant issue in this particular instance.
And what
Yes.
was the,
Oh, sorry.
guess what was the pin?
They got paid pretty well, I think. If I say it, I'm going to guess wrong, but they got paid very well, and then your pay would increase based on the number of miles you flew and if you did things like night duty. So yeah, they were paid pretty well relative to other things, yes.
So there were foreign. What entities did those? Were those like competitors to the airmail? Were they actual international?
Foreign routes, so like especially in the late 1920s, you were starting to get people flying from, say, out of Florida to South America or to some of the island nations in the Caribbean. So they were definitely not competitors. It was more like if you are flying mail from, you know, Miami. And again, that's when you start to see Miami become big. You're flying mail from Miami or places like that to points further
So
south.
really foreign, you mean like international?
Yeah, if foreign meant international mail. Yes.
Yes, because this, I mean, to me, I'm showing my ignorance here, is a pretty unusual and unique topic. And I'm wondering, could you tell us a little bit how you got into the airmail stuff?
So I tripped over this, not literally, but I was an intern in college at the Nebraska Public Records Archives. And their Department of Aeronautics had a box that my boss said, hey, can you sort through this box? And it was on the about organizing the celebration for the 20th anniversary of airmail in 1938. And basically, towns across the country had special flights. In Nebraska, I think there were over 200 towns that ended up getting a special plane for one day. And I was reading, you know, these forms that pilots had to fill out to become employees of the post office, and telegraphs and letters telling pilots or the organization what field to land in. So that got me started, and it's just something that's a fun topic to explore and dig into. And there are so many little facets of it that you just keep going with it. And ultimately, I wrote my master's thesis on airmail in Nebraska. And then you come to Chicago and you actually can go see Checkerboard Field, and you can go to Grant Park where the airmail was, and you just keep finding these little things. I took a day trip to Buchanan, Michigan, and the library there has an archive on, you know, 3-4 boxes of jackknife material. So.
Oh, Kathy, I just wanted to thank you. That was fabulous. You know, I don't know about you guys, but I'm looking at the sky in a whole different way now. Now, I want to announce to all of you and to the people at home that on May 1st at 6 p.m., we will be opening our next temporary exhibition. It's called Maritime Midwest Modern. It's in partnership with the architectural photographer Josh Lipnick, who goes by Midwest Modern online. And it's about all of these different buildings from around the Midwest that are different in style and material and time period, but that are all modern and that all have some kind of connection to the waterways. Maybe it's obvious like a lighthouse, maybe it's less obvious. So come by on May 1st at 6 p.m. It's a Thursday. You can get tickets online. And otherwise, thank you all so much for joining. That was the right announcement, right, Jim? Yeah. Well, thanks all. Thanks, everyone. And you can find Kathy if you have any more questions. Okay.